Currently, you can paralyze the national board, but just by waiting for someone's term to end and then not appointing somebody new. Now you can precipitate this crisis by firing somebody and not appointing somebody new. So it makes it much easier for Republican administrations to paralyze the board nationally and to get rid of a pro-union majority nationally.
Hey, it's Jordan. I am in Flint, Michigan, East Palestine, Ohio, Tumwa, Iowa. Please support the only independent outlet on the ground covering what the corporate media covers up.
Hey, this is Ashley with Status Coup, and I'm here today with Eric Blanc, a longtime labor organizer and author of the new book, We Are the Union, How Worker-to-Worker Organizing is Revitalizing Labor. So thank you so much for being here, Eric. We are going to be talking first about Gwyn Wilcox and the future of the National Labor Relations Board and what this all means for the future of labor in general. So for anyone who needs a refresher, yesterday, Gwyn Wilcox, who had just been reinstated to the NLRB, was again removed from the board. So once again, the NLRB is lacking the 3 members that it needs to have a quorum and make certain decisions. So for some background on what has been happening with Wilcox since Trump took office. So Matt Bruning, who writes the really informative Substack NLRB Edge, he summarized all these decisions really well. So Gwyn Wilcox had been fired from the board on January 28th. And then on, I believe, March 8th, the DC District Court ruled that the Trump administration termination was illegal, and they restated Wilcox. And then on March 28th, a 3-member panel of the DC Circuit Court granted an emergency motion for a stay of the March 6th decision and removed Wilcox again. And then on April 7th, the entire DC Circuit Court vacated the order and reinstated Wilcox again. And then finally, yesterday, the Supreme Court granted a motion for a stay of the March 6th decision and removed Wilcox again. So there's a very, very long sort of recent history of what's been happening. So for those of us who are not as well versed as you are in labor law, what does all of this mean?
Yeah, I mean, the first thing I would say is why people should care. The reason people should care is that all of the crises we're in are rooted in the lack of power between that workers have in relation to bosses. And so you need millions more workers unionizing in order to address income inequality, the rise of the far right, climate catastrophe, all of this stuff. And it is easier to do that when the government is more favorable to you. So Trump, despite his populist rhetoric, has thus far proven to be extremely anti-union. Both in his decisions on the board and then, frankly, also just his whole-scale attack on federal workers, taking away over 1 million federal workers' collective bargaining rights just 2 weeks ago. And so the stakes of it are high for all working people, and particularly then what we should make of the Wilcox back and forth is a couple of things. One is it seems like the major goal of the Trump administration on this is to assert presidential authority. So it's not entirely clear whether Trump actually just wants to paralyze the NLRB or not. It seems like the end goal really is to assert that the president has authority to essentially fire at will any board member. And the Supreme Court may very well end up siding with Trump on this. The collateral damage, though, is that this allows Trump to paralyze the NLRB on a national level. So the National Labor Relations Board on a national level, when it doesn't have quorum, can't make decisions. And so this makes it much harder for it to do its work. It's worth noting, because there's a lot of confusion on this, that many of the key functions of the NLRB still work even when there's no national quorum. And so this is important because the major thing that the NLRB does is helps workers run elections and to file unfair labor practices. And so this can happen even when there's no quorum nationally, because these are under the sort of aegis of regional agencies of the board. And it's important to say that because a lot of workers need to know that they still have the right to unionize and they still have structures to unionize and they can still run NLRB elections even if there's no national quorum, because bosses would want people to think that all of a sudden your rights are gone. And that's not true. But what's clear is that the Trump administration has made it significantly harder to unionize by paralyzing the board, and frankly also the people that it's planning on installing, and its appointees so far have all been management side, is not unexpectedly basically management hacks, as most Republicans are, and so this is just further obstacle towards workers having their constitutional right to unionize protected.
That is all really, really informative, really well said. So I guess I would ask, what do you think is going to be the eventual outcome of all of this? If the NLRB, even if it isn't the express intent necessarily of the Trump administration to paralyze the NLRB, and as you said, he's exercising his presidential authority. With the NLRB still being paralyzed, what is the outcome for us? And as far as the NLRB in the future, how does that affect? How does the decision made here affect that?
Yeah, it's a little bit unclear. I do think the biggest damage in the short term is going to be the paralysis of the national NLRB. So that's in the short term the biggest impact. I think in the long term, it's not going to be such a game changer if, as is probably most likely, that the Supreme Court will most likely grant Trump his wishes, which is to be able to have presidents fire the board members. This isn't such a dramatic shift because even currently the president is able to appoint new members. This is going to make it faster. So even currently the president, no matter who's elected, is able to appoint the new member. So sooner rather than later, you have a Democratic majority, you have a Republican majority. Now this can happen immediately, and it also means that if you want to paralyze the board on a national level, and this is something that certainly Trump is okay with doing, and maybe even is one of his primary goals. I don't know. It's going to make it easier to do that because you don't need to wait just until somebody's term, and these are staggered, ends, as is currently the case. Because currently you can paralyze the national board, but just by waiting for someone's term to end and then not appointing somebody new. Now you can precipitate this crisis by firing somebody and not appointing somebody new. So it makes it much easier for Republican administrations to paralyze the board nationally and to get rid of a pro-union majority nationally. That's not going to be the decisive game changer because, I would just hesitate. I think it's important for people to keep in mind the major utility of the board isn't necessarily even on these national level, but it's essentially on people being able to have a mechanism to run a union election locally, and that's still going to continue. And frankly, the board, even when it's pro-democratic, just doesn't have the powers necessary to get workers past the finish line of a first contract. So it's not like currently labor law is so powerful that it's able to help workers really get all of the things they need to win. It's one tool, but it's a pretty secondary tool still. And so I don't think we should freak out that all of a sudden you can't build a union in the country because of what Trump's doing, but it is a significant blow.
That makes a lot of sense. I guess having all of that in mind, with the acceleration of AI, the mass layoffs of federal workers, which you've mentioned, and I know you're very knowledgeable about, and the climate crisis, which is accelerating, as you again mentioned. I cannot think of a worse time to have an NLRB that isn't fully functional. So, there's that on the one hand. And then also, as far as moving forward with a very fragile labor movement, what do you think labor does from here? Or what would you hope to see labor doing from here? Again, keeping in mind everything that you just said about the NLRB and, frankly, the shortcomings of the NLRB already.
Yeah, I think in the short term, the most important thing that needs to happen in the labor movement is to defeat the insane attacks of the Trump administration and Musk against the federal workforce, which are really an attack on all working people, on a couple of grounds. One is that if you're able to decimate the federal public services, this is going to hurt the living standards and conditions of basically all Americans, because how are you going to get your Social Security check if they cut the Social Security workforce in half? How are you going to have safe water and food and air if there's no EPA to regulate companies? Who's going to deliver your Medicaid and Medicare benefits? So these attacks on the federal workforce impact all working people, and frankly, the whole labor movement should be up in arms against what Musk and Trump are doing. And the response so far, frankly, has been like well short of what's needed. It's been mostly just through the legal route, which is important, and it's good they're suing the government. But the Supreme Court is ultimately going to do the wrong thing on most of this, and so it's pretty limited what you're going to be able to get out of the courts. And so you need to be able to combine a legal strategy with a mass action, mass protest, mass disruption strategy, and that's what the labor movement historically has done when it's won in the 1930s. And it is not currently in that war footing. The leaderships of the unions, for the most part, are stuck in business as usual, and are sort of not giving the signals to their base that this is the time for fighting, not at least in a strong enough way. Fortunately, some of the rank and file federal workers are sort of rising up on their own and are organizing. There's a new federal unionist network, the Fund, which has been taking a lead on mass protest. That got a lot of federal workers out last Saturday and April 5th for these mass protests we saw all over the country. So we're going to need a lot more of that. We're going to need a lot more mass protests, but we're also going to need a lot more mass disruption. And in the federal sector, that might not take the form of strikes, because Musk probably would fire workers if they struck illegally. And so I think people are going to be pretty wary to do that. But you can still do mass disruption and have mass sit-ins at congressional offices, at Tesla dealerships, across the board, to make a political crisis and to grab people's attention and to make it clear that the public is not going to stand for the destruction of all of these sort of essential services. So that's what the labor movement as a whole should be doing at this immediate moment. And I think if the labor movement is able to beat back the worst of Trump's attacks on democracy and these services, I think that's going to set in turn the basis for a social explosion, which we just got a glimpse of April 5th, which can pour then into back into private sector fightbacks. And so I do think that what Trump and Musk are doing is extremely unpopular. There's a huge amount of overreach, and they're sort of pushing and precipitating a real explosion nationally because of the unpopularity of what they're doing. And that energy then is going to need to find a place to cohere for lasting change, because it's not going to be enough just to at best defeat these attacks or even to win in the next election. We need a social force that is able to transform the political economy of this country, and that social force is the labor movement. And so you're going to need to go from the defense to the offense. You need to win the defensive battles first. We haven't won that yet, but once you do that, and that's a big if, we'll see, but I think it's doable. Then you pivot towards unionizing Amazon, unionizing Tesla, winning a first contract at Starbucks, unionizing the South in auto, and doing that in a way that builds off of the momentum of these defensive battles. It goes on the march ahead.
Absolutely. That is all really well said. I guess I would just ask if there's anything else that you would want to add, anything else that you think other working people should know in this moment.
Yeah, I think for any listeners, there's really specific things that people could do, and I think that it's important to talk about these, because there's maybe a perception still of just doom and gloom that nothing can be done, and it's understandable. I've also had my moments of despair over the last year or two and the last few months, but I think particularly after last Saturday, with April 5th, where we saw there's so many millions of people willing to take the streets, I think it's incumbent on people, listeners, to get organized and to not wait for other people to do it, but to understand, this is a pivotal moment in history. The American democracy and American public sector and it's sort of the existence of a labor movement, democratic rights is at stake. And so what are you going to do? Are you going to just sort of post online, or are you going to do something more? And so I think that something more is really concrete. You can go to get involved in supporting the federal workers. If you are a federal worker, or if you want to just save Social Security and Medicare, all of these things, you can go to savepublicservices.com and sign up there to hear about upcoming actions around federal workers in your area, but then also to get involved in the movement. So that's savepublicservices.com. People should also unionize their own workplace. So one of the best ways you can build power against the billionaires is by building a union. And then, so it's harder under Trump for sure, but it's maybe even more necessary than it was before. And so the best way to organize your workplace is with some support. The way to get that support is you can go to get the help of the Emergency Workplace Organizing Committee, or EWOC. You just go to workerorganizing.org, fill out a form, and within 72 hours, an experienced organizer will get in touch with you to help you start taking the steps to build power at work. So those are like two really concrete things that I think people can do if they want to start building power. And it's ultimately going to be, I think, up to the rank and file to lead. I don't think we should expect the top leadership of the union movement to do the right thing if there's not a real amount of pushback from below.
Absolutely. That was all great. I think that viewers should listen to everything that Eric just said. If you can organize your workplace or get involved in any way, you absolutely should do that. Thank you so much for being with us, Eric. I really appreciate all of this.
I have one more. I forgot. I have one more. That's okay. Yeah, so I just remembered the one other thing you could do if you want to organize the labor movement is you can become a SALT. So what a SALT is getting a job at in order to unionize it. So you can purposely get a job at Starbucks or Amazon or an auto to help these strategic union campaigns. And so there's a new initiative called Workers Organizing Workers to basically train up a whole new generation of SALT. So this is a really effective tactic that's been used recently with great success, and that I think is going to be pivotal over the coming months and years. And so you can sign up there easily. You just go to bit.ly/saltnow. So it's bit.ly/saltnow. And there's a form you can sign up there if you want to express interest in becoming SALT.
Awesome. That was an excellent last point. Again, if you are listening and that's interesting to you, you should look into that more. Again, thank you so much for being with us here. We really appreciate all the information and for explaining to us what's happening with the NLRB right now and what is, what the future of the labor movement might look like for working people. So thank you again, and I hope we talk soon.
All right, thanks for having me on.